Hello, qualitative researchers. This is a short video on how to collect and process qualitative data. So welcome to looking at a little more in-depth look at the qualitative data collection process and some of those procedures. What we really want to do is answer the question, how can qualitative data collection help us understand the answers to our research questions? So what methods might we first want to look at? Let's take a look at the different traditions and see what might fit those. Here we have the 5 different common traditions or approaches to qualitative research. And you'll see that the first talks about narrative, and it talks about the purpose, where individuals or groups, small groups, tell their story. And in the instance of the narrative tradition, we might see a lot of multiple interviews, so that there's a number of times that we go back and ask about information. And then secondly, we might also look at some of the artifacts. So let's say that we're talking to a group of people in Alaska, and we might want to see some of the things they use in their daily lives that we could photograph and maybe have them tell us about as we interviewed them, so that we could really understand a little more about their experiences. Phenomenological qualitative research, we are wanting to hear maybe a little larger group of people share their experiences and their perceptions. This is the most common method that's used, and of course the interview process is the most common that's done for that. You can also do focus groups for phenomenology, as well as journals or email surveys. There might also be some observations if you wanted to really see what was happening. Maybe you're talking about teachers and you want to observe a class. And there again, artifacts might come into play, something that you want them to show you and tell you about. Grounded theory, where we're trying to develop the processes that people experience, also generally requires multiple interviews, and that can be multiple interviews with more than one person. Ethnography, if we remember that that's the culture that we're looking at, typically has multiple interviews as well. And there we also see that the participant observer aspect of data collection, where the researcher might actually go to events, maybe have a meal with a group of people and really observe and ask them things. So it's sort of a participant, you participate in some of that activity, but you're also making observations. And there again, artifacts can be helpful. And then the 5th tradition, case study, where a single event or multiple events are looked at around a period of time for some experience that has happened to generally multiple people. Interviews again and artifacts might be helpful there. So those are the 5 traditions and some of the more common ways that we collect data for each of them. Now, underlying any of these is that we want to take a look again at our research questions and the overarching question as well as the sub-questions, and say, what are the best tools or instruments to answer the research questions? And how can the qualitative data tools that we develop really get us to good answers that are deep and meaningful and not just superficial? So when we look at data gathering questions, we want to, while every one of these things is important, the data collecting tools that we develop and the methods and procedures we use to gather the information are very central to making sure that we get the data that we need to answer those research questions. So the most common aspect of data collection for qualitative studies is the interview. And individuals lots of times do face-to-face interviews, but they can also be via, let's say, Skype, or sometimes here at the college, people use WebEx because we have that access, so that we aren't limited to those things that are just face-to-face. And sometimes you can reach a different population or your sample of participants can be broader if you use some of those more virtual interview aspects. We did talk about having multiple interviews, the iterative process of gathering or interviewing someone and then reviewing the interview transcript and then developing the next set of questions based upon that interview that has already taken place. Maybe we want to expand on it or talk about something that's sort of peripheral to what they had shared the first time, so that it is more multiple but periodic interview process. The fourth aspect of doing interviews is when you have a group called a focus group, and maybe there are 6 to 8 people that you invite to come for an hour interview session or a 2-hour interview session. There are some pros and cons of that. You have your interview questions developed, but as you can see with a group, one of the cons can be people can get off track, or they can piggyback their answers on each other's work and not really think about what their personal experiences are if they get sort of lost in someone else's ideas. On the other hand, a benefit can be that there's a synergism that can promote them adding to someone else's work, and they might not have thought of something and they'll be like, oh, that happened to me too, but in my instance, and so they can go on in that kind of a sharing that's open and more dynamic. So there are pros and cons to focus groups, and they have to be very well managed so that they don't become just a complaint session. And then finally, more recently, we've seen a lot of online surveys where the questions are sent out via an email or a like SurveyMonkey, where people can be asked the questions. It gives them a little time to process those things at their own convenience, as well as be maybe a little more thoughtful about that. But all of them, any of these can be helpful. Now, when you're thinking about developing interview questions, there are some major things to consider. You want to make sure that you're looking at each research question and what interview questions can gather that information for you. There might be some information from the literature review that you did that are like, oh, I want to make sure I find out about this component because that's so prevalent in the literature. You might have some personal experience that you're wondering about, although you don't want to impart your personal experiences, but maybe there's something that you have seen frequently and you're wondering if other people have had that similar experience and what their perceptions of that are. When you're developing your questions, you might want someone else, an expert in the content, to review the questions to make sure that they're valid and that they're also logical. And then it's a great idea to test or pilot those questions. Maybe you have a peer that you could ask to complete the survey, or that you could actually interview to practice, and you will find a little more detail about if those questions are helpful in arriving at the answers you want or that you are searching for regarding the research questions. And then developing probes. You really want to have some basic questions that expand the answers that people give so that they don't tell you yes and no things, or that they're like, well, yeah, that was problematic for me, but... and they aren't telling you much detail. So then you want to have some probes that ask them to give an example or explain more about something. And then a caution or two, you want to make sure that you have balanced questions, that you aren't unidirectional, meaning that you aren't all asking about the negative aspects of a situation or experiences, but maybe you'll have, so what were the biggest challenges of doing that, or the biggest problem you faced, and then what was the best support you had, or the greatest success that came out of that experience, so that you're really balancing and not having it just go in one direction. And then I think the most difficult piece for lots of researchers in qualitative is to avoid imparting their personal bias, so that you don't want to share your experiences or have leading questions that want you to guide the person to the answers you're expecting, but really have broad open questions. Now, in your Module 3, there's also a video, a short video that you can watch about interviews, and expands on it a little more and gives some great examples, but some other things for you to think about regarding the interview process. So you can look at that in conjunction with this PowerPoint, and you will have a little broader experience with interviewing. While the interview questions are important, there are also very important data gathering procedures. So you have the tools or instruments that you develop, but you also have to have a plan. So you want to make sure that there's some place that you can either do interviews or some way that you can reach your participants. You want to audio or videotape if you're doing interviews. And you want to make sure that you have batteries and test out. And sometimes people take two ways of audio or video taping so that they don't have some catastrophe with some of the equipment. A field note protocol, meaning that you have a protocol. These are the directions. These are the demographic pieces I'm going to ask about, like age or years of experience, those kinds of things you'll want to have. And then maybe you'll always set up in a certain way that they have to, that you give them an overview of the purpose of the qualitative research study, and then have them sign the consents and explain that, and then go into some of the, well, thank you for participating, and this should take only so many minutes, things like that. So you'll have your directions, and maybe you would even have how you would sit face-to-face, or if you're doing via Skype, how you would reach a person and manage any of the glitches that can occur. If you're doing a focus group, you might want another person to help you manage some of the group dynamics. Sometimes if things drift off and you're concentrating on listening, a person might say you might want to get them back on track, or help manage the time factor, things like that. And then as we mentioned, you would sometimes develop other questions following the first interview if you're having multiple interviews. Now, when you're considering an online survey, lots of times we think of survey as being quantitative, but you can ask open-ended questions and ask for examples or what a day is like in the life of whatever the participants' experiences are. Lots of times you'll have an email invitation that explains a little about your study. You want to make sure that you have a secure study vehicle, so maybe SurveyMonkey. Here we have had in the past Qualtrics as an internal one that people can use, the students can use, but SurveyMonkey is probably the most common, or you might have others that you have access to. And so the next item is observations, and you can be a non-participant where you're just making observations without interacting with the people, but for the aspect of cultural and case studies, you might become more of a participant. There again, you want to have a protocol of what you're going to be doing, and maybe you'll have a grid on that protocol of behaviors you're going to observe, and make little hash marks as you go through that. And then if there is more than one observer, you will want to make sure you're all consistent in that. And then you decide if you have single or multiple observations. And then sometimes the biggest challenge of doing observations is gaining access to the participants. Sometimes that can be challenging, and you have to work on that relationship piece. And then one of the areas I think most interesting is the artifact or audio visuals, where you can look at the people's works such as journals or artwork, and records, procedures, and policies, and ask them to tell you about that, and you want to make sure you record those things as well. So there are a number of challenges that we've talked about, and then also there are lots of benefits to get rich data to come from your interviews or your